Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're looking at something, well, you could say controversial. We've got this article, it's called The Theft of Meaning, How Literacy Became Enclosure.
Catchy title.
Yeah, right. And it's by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD. You know, when you see literacy, you might think, oh, okay, reading, writing, got it. But this one's different. Hoerricks actually argues that the way we usually think about literacy, the traditional way, can actually be like a way to control people instead of setting them free.
It really flips the script. We usually think of literacy as this positive thing, right?
Yeah.
Expanding your horizons, all that.
Exactly. But Hoerricks is pushing us to look deeper, to question those assumptions. And they start with this really personal story that kind of sets the stage for the whole article. They're talking about getting this email, one of those thought you might find this interesting forwards.
We've all been there.
Yeah, totally. It seems harmless enough, right? But for Hoerricks, it's like it triggers all these emotions. Like, have you ever had that where something small just like hits a nerve?
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
because that email, for them, it represents the whole system they're critiquing. It's like being handed a brochure for something you know is messed up.
Right. And it's even worse because the person sending it just assumes, oh, you're a literacy expert. You'll love this. But Horrocks makes this really interesting distinction between a literacy expert and a literacy survivor.
Yeah, that really stuck with me, too. There's a big difference.
It's like one fits neatly into the system, the other has had to fight just to have their way of knowing recognized at all.
Exactly. And that leads right into the core of the article, the idea of the one versus the myriad.
Okay, break that down for us. What's that all about?
Sure. The one, it's that standardized, top-down approach to literacy we all know, right? Speed, efficiency, fitting into the box. But Horrocks is arguing that it's not just about reading and writing. It's about power, control, whose knowledge matters and whose gets ignored.
So, like, there's only one right way to learn and understand everything?
That's the message the one sends, yeah. And that's where the myriad comes in. It's all those other ways of knowing, diverse, holistic, the stuff that often gets pushed aside. Like think about stories passed down in your family, traditions you've learned, how you connect to your culture. That's all part of the myriad, things you can't measure on a standardized test.
Makes you realize how limited our definition of literacy usually is.
Totally. And that's what Horrocks calls literacy as enclosure. They're saying this focus on the one, it actually traps us instead of freeing us.
So instead of opening doors to knowledge, it's putting up walls.
Exactly. It's about controlling access, deciding who's in, who's out.
It's kind of like imagine a classroom where there's only one kind of book, one way to talk that's correct, and anyone who's different is seen as wrong. That's enclosure happening right there. Like you're being told what you're allowed to know and how you're allowed to express yourself. Have you ever felt that, like pressure to conform when you were learning?
Oh, yeah. And what's even more concerning is how Horrocks points out the whole literacy industry. Those programs, the tests, they're part of this enclosure, too.
Mm.
It's about profit, keeping things the way they are, not actual learning.
It's like they're selling us a product that keeps us in a box instead of helping us break free.
And this enclosure, it has real consequences. Horrocks talks about feeling like a ghost in classrooms, trying to fit into a system that didn't recognize their way of knowing. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, feeling unseen or unheard when you're trying to learn.
Absolutely. Like your perspective, your unique way of seeing things, it just gets dismissed. And that can stick with you, impact how you feel about learning, about yourself even.
Yeah, it's like you have to leave a part of yourself behind to fit in. And think what makes this article so powerful is that Horrocks is weaving in their own experiences, their own story. It's not just like some abstract theory. You can feel how personal it is. Absolutely. And they talk about growing up in a culture where knowledge was shared through oral traditions, breath and voice, they call it. And then having to conform to this system that values written language above all else.
It really makes you think, what do we lose when we only value certain ways of knowing? How much are we missing out on?
That's what Horrocks is getting at when they talk about the one and the myriad in the context of their own life. They talk about their West Highland kinship, carrying history not in writing, but in the way a story lives inside you.
Such a powerful image, right? And such a contrast to the one, which came in with colonialism, measuring fluency by how fast you can read, how much you can produce, not the depth of meaning in oral traditions.
It's like valuing a machine over a person almost.
And that brings us back to this whole idea of literacy as enclosure. Traditional literacy education, with its emphasis on the one, it's not really about opening up knowledge for everyone. It's more about control, gatekeeping. And the consequences of that are huge because you're basically saying these ways of knowing, these cultures, these languages, they're not as good. Think about what that does to a kid trying to figure out who they are, trying to find their voice.
Absolutely. It can
Yeah.
make you feel ashamed, like you're
Yeah.
not good enough, like you don't belong.
There's this line, I wrote it down because it hit me hard. I was never meant to understand within their system. I was only meant to function within it. It's like the goal is obedience, not understanding.
Exactly. And this goes back to that point about the literacy industry. Hoerricks describes this market flooded with programs, tests, all reinforcing this narrow definition of literacy. It's about hitting metrics, not actual comprehension.
Like teaching someone to use a tool, but never explaining how it works or why it matters.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what happens when we prioritize efficiency over meaning? What do we lose? Hoerricks even asks directly, why is meaning so often secondary in literacy instruction? A simple question, but it gets right to the problem.
It really does. If we're not focused on meaning, what are we even teaching? Just decoding words, but not engaging with the ideas they represent.
That's the risk. We end up with this kind of literacy that's all about following the rules, not thinking critically. And Hoerricks argues this isn't an accident. This lack of focus on meaning, it benefits the people in power, the ones who want things to stay the same.
Because if people can't really think for themselves, if they can't analyze information, they're easier to control, right? It's about keeping people passive.
Exactly. And that's why Hoerricks' call for a more inclusive, more liberating approach to literacy is so important. They want us to create learning spaces that value different ways of knowing, where critical thinking is encouraged, where students can find their own voices.
You know, something else that really struck me was how Horrocks uses poetry throughout the article.
Oh, yeah. Those poems add a whole other layer, right? They're like a counterpoint to the one, a reminder of all the ways language can express meaning, evoke feelings, connect us to the world.
There's one in particular, The Literacy of Empire, that really stayed with me. It's divided into these three sections. The one, the myriad, and the reckoning.
Such a smart structure, right? It lets them contrast these opposing forces so clearly.
In the one section, it's all about that pressure to conform, decode, drill, repeat, valuing speed over understanding.
And then the myriad, the language changes completely. It becomes more lyrical. You can feel the beauty and complexity of all those ways of knowing that often get ignored.
It's like they're reclaiming language itself, showing how it can be so much more than what fits in the one. And then the reckoning section. Man, it's raw. There's this anger, this frustration with how traditional literacy education has failed so many people.
It's a powerful critique. Hoerricks writes, they build their empires on metrics and measures, on scripted lessons and market shares. Their programs do not seek to teach, only to count, to track, to sell. It gets right to the core of the problem.
It does. It's like they're saying this isn't about education. It's about control and profit.
And then that last line, their literacy is not fluency. It is enclosure. It is standardization. It is the theft of meaning.
Oof. Yeah, that hits hard. But it's also a call to action. Like, we have to do better. We need to reclaim meaning, create a system that values all learners, all ways of knowing. But how do we even do that? Where do we start?
That is the big question, right? How do we go from just talking about the problem to actually doing something? How do we create a system that really supports all the different ways people learn and understand things?
Right, because Hoerricks isn't giving us like a 10-step plan or anything, but they do give us some places to start. And I think the most basic one is just recognizing that there are all these different ways of knowing, and they're all valuable. We need to get past this idea that literacy is just reading and writing in one specific way.
Yeah, we need to broaden our definition of what literacy even means. Think about indigenous knowledge systems, or how knowledge is passed down through stories in so many cultures. Those are forms of literacy too, even if they don't look like what we're used to.
Exactly. And to be truly inclusive, we need to make space for those voices, those perspectives that haven't always been valued in traditional schools. It's not about replacing one system with another. It's about having a wider view, a more holistic view of what it means to be literate.
Like adding more colors to our palette instead of just sticking with black and white.
Oh, I like that. And it makes me think about how we often focus on teaching kids to just decode words, but we don't always help them connect with the meaning behind those words. It's like we care more about how fast they can read than whether they actually understand what they're reading. What if we flipped that?
Now, that's interesting. What if meaning was at the center of how we teach literacy? Like encouraging students to ask, What does this mean to me? How does it connect to my life, my experiences? Not just, can I read this out loud perfectly?
It's about more than just technical skills, right? It's about fostering a love of learning, a curiosity about the world, a desire to really engage with ideas and make connections. And that means we need to rethink not just how we teach literacy, but how we measure it, too.
You're right, because if we really value all these different ways of knowing, then how we assess students needs to reflect that. Standardized tests that just measure a narrow set of skills, those aren't going to work.
Because those tests often end up making the inequalities worse, right?
But
They favor students who come from certain backgrounds, who've had access to certain resources.
Mhm.
We need to find ways to assess not just fluency and comprehension, but things like critical thinking, creativity, the ability to make connections, to use what you know in different situations.
Exactly. We need to remember that literacy is more than just skills. It's a way of being in the world, engaging with ideas, finding your voice, and sharing it.
Which brings us back to that powerful line at the end of the article where Hoerricks writes, literacy, true literacy, is not about reading at speed, not about decoding for efficiency, not about conformity. It is about understanding.
So simple, but so profound.
It reminds us that the goal isn't to create workers who just follow orders. It's to create critical thinkers, engaged citizens, people who can understand the world and make it better.
Definitely something worth striving for.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. If traditional literacy education is a form of enclosure, like Hoerricks says, what would a more open, more inclusive approach look like? In your own life, in your community, in the world, how can we make sure everyone has the chance to develop their own unique ways of knowing and understanding things?
It's a question that takes ongoing reflection and conversation and action, but it's a conversation worth having, a journey worth taking.
Thank you so much for joining us on this one, everyone. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.